this week is all about this. What Paul had a right to, but did not take. Okay, he had a right to this, but he did not take. Right, which is money, essentially money from the Corinthians. Okay, so let us begin. Okay, so let's read. All right, so he starts by saying, "Am I not free? Am I not an apostle?" So I'm free, right? I'm free to do this. Like, I'm an apostle. He's sort of defending himself. Have I not seen Jesus the Lord? Are you not my workmanship in the Lord? So remember, he's the one who came and started this church, planted this church, led these people to Christ, changed their eternal destinies, right? So he's like, are you not my workmanship in the Lord? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you. I mean, I came and gave you the gospel, right? For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. And this is my defense. So again, he's kind of defending himself, right? Because they were sort of looking down on Paul, right? This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right? Do we not have the right? Am I not free? Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas, that's Peter? So like, yeah, these people have, I have the right to. Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? And this is what he's going to talk about for the rest of the chapter. Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Or who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? Right? He's like, I'm laboring, but I'm not even getting from you. Do I say these things on human authority? Right? It's just as humans. No, he's going to start talk about the Old Testament. Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen the Lord, the God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake because the plowman should plow in hope and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. Right? The worker works and then he gets some of the benefit. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, this is interesting. So that means they did actually pay other people, probably when Paul came by or Apollos came by, and that was their rightful claim. But Paul did not. He did not receive that. He refused to receive that. He didn't charge them. Do we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right? I have the right to receive from you, but I have not made use of it, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. Right? So it was his right to make a living off of his preaching, but he did not take that money from them. Okay, that's kind of the issue here. So how then did Paul make money? Acts 18. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. He found a Jew named Aquila, native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. When he see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked. For they were tent makers by trade. And what else did he do? He reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Greeks and the Jews. So Paul was a bivocational minister. He was a tent maker by trade. So what he would do is he would make tents. He's from a province that was famous for its goat hair, which apparently made good tents. I don't know. Anyway, so we read later in Acts that he, in Ephesus, for example, he preached at the Hall of Tyrannus. He preached probably from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m., which was the ancient world's siesta time. Do you guys know what siesta is? Yeah, it's this amazing thing that they do in Spain. Nap time. It's basically midday nap time, okay? I personally, my body's kind of taking a nap during that time anyway, but anyway, and it was the heat of the day, so 11 to 4, they would just sleep, okay? They would work in the morning, sleep, and then continue on later in the day. So that was so what Paul did was during that nap time, he rented out a hall and preached, okay? So probably in the morning he's working, and then he's preaching. And then at nighttime, he would probably do a lot of ministry, kind of going from house to house, right? So that was sort of his daily schedule. Likely his schedule was similar in Corinth. So in this way, he would support himself by making tents and selling them. Another thing that he did was receive money from the other churches. So in 2 Corinthians, he says this, indeed, I consider that I am not in the least inferior to these super apostles. So again, he's still defending himself, okay? Even if I'm unskilled in speaking, I am not so in knowledge. Indeed, in every way I've made this plain to you in all things. Or did I commit a sin in humbling myself so that you may be exalted? Because I preached God's gospel to you free of charge. I robbed other churches. I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. And when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. So I refrained and will refrain from burdening you in any way. So he received money by working in the tent, by making tents. He also received money from other churches, the Philippians, Thessalonians, right? The more godly churches. So that's sort of what happened there. So why does he preach it to them free of charge? Why does he refrain and doesn't want to burden them in any way? Right? Back to 1 Corinthians 9, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. I don't know what it was about the Corinthian church, but they probably had something about money. We read later that there was a huge divide between the rich and the poor, and the rich would eat all of the Lord's Supper and leave none of it for the poor. And there was a class kind of clash. And maybe Paul just discerned, you know what, this congregation, they're not ready. I can't ask them to give me money because it would further cause division. He didn't want to put any obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ being preached. So he said, all right, that's fine. I have a right to take from you. I should. And in other cases I have. But for you guys, I don't want to put an obstacle. So I'm not going to do it. I'm going to rob other churches instead. And I'm going to sit there making tents so I can support myself, right? So that's what that was going on. He surrendered his rights for the salvation of souls. Now, I think what's sad is that this should give him double honor, right? You look at this and you're like, that is so awesome that he refrained his rights in order to benefit them. But instead what they did was they looked down on him. They started to say oh, Paul, yeah, he's all right, I guess, but he doesn't speak quite as well as Apollos does, and oh, but did you hear Peter preaching later? He was with Jesus at the time. I think Peter's way better than Paul. And they started to sort of look down on Paul. They owed Paul their very lives, but instead of being inspired by him, they started to look down on him. You have these stories in marketing. It's there's a Native American gift shop, let's say, and it's full of turquoise stones or whatever, right? And let's say it's priced at $2. Not many people buy them. Versus you take the same stones and you charge $50 and then you say it's 50% off, suddenly sales go up, right? Because you look at the price and you're I'm not sure how to value this. You look at the price and go, oh, yeah, this is probably pretty valuable. It's just 50% off, so I'm going to take that, right? Let's say you have a professor, I don't know what your professors are like, but man, if your professor has a British accent, they just sound smarter, you know what I'm saying? He's well kind of dressed and tweed jacket, and kind of tall and thin and has that accent, you know what I'm saying? And he comes in and he kind of uses all these long words and sounds really intellectual, right? You look at that guy and you're oh, whatever he says must be true. So intellectual, right? Versus I don't know, a short, portly Southern preacher, from Mississippi, who says God in 4 syllables, right? And you sort of look at that guy and what's your immediate kind of evaluation of what he's saying? So you look at two things and you go oh, what's the value of that? But there could be more life-giving truth in one sentence of the Southern preacher versus this professor who has no idea what he's talking about. So are you able to value things properly? Modern church, we talked about this actually a lot at the EDM conference. Modern church, it's sort of made everything about the Sunday service, right? It has become a show, right? So people come to see a show, to hear an awesome celebrity pastor give an amazing talk, versus, I don't know, someone who's sort of like working hard, moving quickly, coiling cables, sweating as they're kind of moving from place to place, cooking for people all week, inviting people to his home, meeting people to counsel them, all free of charge. So I've been to a few conferences over the years, and this one was very different. I went to one a year ago called Exponential. It was a huge conference. It was like thousands of people. I forgot, 5,000, 6,000 people, something like that. It was this amazing, amazing church. Like the lights, the sound, the band was incredible. It turns out that they had gotten 4 different bands and took all the praise leaders from each band, and that was the band. It was amazing. And the speakers were amazing. They were all really famous kind of people who really eloquent. This conference, the band was okay. The sound guy was okay. There's feedback here and there. The Propri dude, thank you, Propri. But yeah, I started getting a little frustrated at the Propri dude. It's late most of the time. I was and the speakers there were not that great, actually, in my opinion. They were okay. They weren't as polished as the other conference. But everyone at the EDM conference, they were all practitioners. They weren't celebrity people. They've been in it. They've been doing ministry on campus for decades. And it's there's a very different quality about that. They were people, they were talking about stories in which they shared the gospel and led people to Christ the past week. These are people who were on the campus every week for decades. And so you could sort of look at those two conferences and wow, this was amazing. This was so polished. And then this was kind of but for me, it was this was way more powerful. I think what's amazing is sort of how Apostle Paul actually goes through the trouble of defending himself. Because if it were me and the Corinthians started talking to me like that, I made tents and I robbed other churches just so I could, and I worked my butt off every day to bring you the gospel, and this is how you're going to respond to me? If they had done that to me, I would have been fine. See you later. I'm out of here, man. I'm going to hang out with the Philippians, man. But Paul doesn't do that. He actually defends himself. Why does he do that? Because he loves them. He wants to, even though that's incredibly offensive, how they respond to him, he goes, you know what? I still want to reason with you. I still want to defend myself. I still want to show you, am I not an apostle? Am I not free? And he reasons with them again. I mean, think about how demeaning it is for him to do that. This is Paul. He was one of the intellectual giants of the ancient world. I mean, how many churches did he start? And the Corinthians are sort of treating him this way. It's kind of I don't know, I was thinking about Mother's Day. I had dinner with my mom last night. And I wanted to take her somewhere nice, but she wanted to go to Chipotle. For 2 reasons. One is she had a gift card, $100 gift card. She's no, we got to use the gift card, and then the second reason is she's Dad doesn't like Chipotle, but I like Chipotle, so I can only go if it's with you guys, right? So I was all right, fine, we'll go with Chipotle. So we went there, and I love my mom, but I don't know, from a certain perspective, if you looked at her a certain way, she doesn't speak English very well. Her hair is thinning. She has rheumatoid arthritis. She can't walk right. She has a limp when she walks. Her eyes are getting worse. She can't drive. Her memory's getting worse. She loves to tell stories, and she just tells the same stories again and again and again, right? That's the kind of one feature of Irene is the only girl in our family, right? Because it's my dad, and it's me, it's my brother, and all of us kind of, I'm sorry, but we sort of stopped listening to my mom. She kind of good. But Irene listens, and so she tells Irene, I think she's heard the same stories 50 times. Like, what if I was really embarrassed by my mom? Like, really embarrassed by her. Like, let's say I was in like a middle school, and we used to have a Mazda MPV, really beat up Mazda MPV, and I'm like, Mom, can you like not drop me off at school? Can you like drop me off like a couple blocks away from school? I'm kind of embarrassed by you. Um, when you see me in a crowd, like don't yell at me. Um, can you stop talking so loud in Korean? In this restaurant, like you're just embarrassing me. Can you stop making Korean stuff for lunch? Like why are we so poor? Like we can't afford the Lunchables like all the other kids have, and I have to like eat this. Like if I were to respond this way, I think what should happen is a giant hand from heaven should come and just slap me like you ungrateful little right. So, like that's what should happen. But like yeah, I just kind of thought, how would my mom respond to that? I think she would sort of respond like Apostle Paul. She would take it and it would hurt, but she would reason with me, right? She's not going to cut that relationship off. She's like, fine, leave. She's not going to do that. Like what was going on was I didn't recognize love, right? I didn't recognize the sacrifice. Like all those things may be true to some degree. Yeah, it was kind of embarrassing when my mom yelled my Korean name in a group of my friends. Yeah, sure, I guess. And there is some part of that's true, but what I was ignoring was like all the ways that she had loved me and sacrificed for me. The difficulty that my parents had when they traveled to the U.S. with a 2-year-old, my older brother, and I was 6 months old at the time. Growing up without a green card, being undocumented for about 15 years. The painful hours of being stressed out about finances every single day, but shielding that from me. I didn't know about this until later. I had a very happy childhood. Only later did I realize that my parents were shielding their financial worries from me every day of their life by putting on a good face and trying to make a happy household. She was working at the ice cream store 13 hours a day, 6 days a week for 20 years. That's probably why she has arthritis now, because she was scooping all day, making cakes on her feet. Like, what if I were to send her a letter now and say, Mom, you were not such a bad mom, but I think you could have done better, Like you didn't have much knowledge and your speaking ability was not that great. Like this is what the Corinthians were doing to Paul, right? What should the Corinthians have done? What should the Corinthians have done in their relationship with Paul? Like if we could rewind time, like how would you advise the Corinthians, right? I think they should have said sorry. And they should have said thank you. And they should have been specific in all the ways that Apostle Paul sacrificed on their behalf. And so I just want to pause here. I just want to pause here, sort of our first application point here, to honor those who have sacrificed and surrendered their rights out of love for you. Like who was that in your life? Now I know that not everyone has a great relationship with their mom. Maybe some of you didn't sort of have a mom figure growing up, so I get that. And in some ways, this day could be a little bit painful in that regard. But I think God sends us people. Might be your mom, it might be a spiritual mom, someone who sort of loved you and sacrificed for you, surrendered their rights for you, who spent time with you and showed you the gospel in a way that they didn't have to and kind of opened up their life to you. And so I just want to spend some time to do that, to honor those who have sacrificed in love for you. Okay, so you can write it down. You could write it on your handout. You can even start texting someone. Okay, I'm going to give you like a couple minutes to do this. So if you feel like you might not finish your text, then maybe write it on a note and finish it later and then text it later or whatever you want to do, okay? But if you're going to use your phone, I would just ask you to not like start checking Instagram and stuff like that, okay? All right, so I just want to give you like a couple minutes to start thinking about someone. Maybe it's your mom, maybe it's someone else. Maybe you want to write it to multiple people. Someone who's sacrificed for you out of love, okay? And just write some thoughts down. Be specific, and I want you to send it to them. If you're going to write it down, maybe you can take a picture and send it to them or whatever. Okay, so give you a couple minutes to do that. The next sections will be shorter, I promise. All right, so what is Paul's motivation? Why does he go through all of these lengths? Why he's like, I'm going to defend myself and this and that, whatever. Like, of course, yes, it's because he loves them, but it's actually a little bit more than that too. He doesn't surrender his rights just because he thinks the Corinthians are cute, right? He surrenders his rights to remove any obstacle for them receiving the gospel, right? So from the yellow, nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. So from verse 15 and on, but I have made no use of any of these rights. Why? Nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. He's like, I'm not guilt-tripping you so that you'll send me money now. That's not what this is about, okay? For I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting. It's like, I have to preach the gospel. I'm not boasting because I'm preaching the gospel. But I am glad that I did not put any obstacle there for you, right? For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting. For necessity is laid upon me. Wow. He's like, I have to preach the gospel, right? Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have reward. But if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with the stewardship. What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as to not make full use of my right in the gospel. Right? So again, it's that same theme. Right? What does love result in? It's not using your rights, but limiting yourself out of love. Right? For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all. I am free from all. I don't have to have anything to do with you guys. I'm free from you. But I have made myself a servant to all. Why? That I might win more of them. To the Jews, I became as a Jew, in order to win Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak, I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. Not everyone's going to respond, but I have made myself all things to all people. Some people might respond to the gospel. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share with them in its blessings, the blessings of the gospel, the blessings of living a life rightly related to God, the blessings of eternal life in Jesus. I want to share with everyone I possibly can so that they would share with me in these blessings. And towards that end, I'm going to become everyone to anyone. I'm free from all, but I make myself a servant to all so that I can share with them in their blessings. This is the total opposite of you do you, right? You do you and I'll do me. You go live your life and I'll live my life. This is not Apostle Paul at all. He's like, you do you and I'm going to do you too. Like, I'm going to do whatever you do, right? Like, if you're a Jew, I'm going to do like the Jews do. So it's a really amazing, like, Paul, like, theologically, he was very, very clear that you don't need to be circumcised. In many ways, that's what Galatians is about. But when he was ministering with Timothy to the Jews, he made Timothy get circumcised. Why? He didn't need to. He knew that. But to the Jew, he became a Jew. So in Acts 16, verses 1 through 5, it says this: Paul came to Derbe and to Lystra. A disciple was there named Timothy, son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. As they went on their way through the cities, they delivered to them for observance for the decision that had been reached by the apostles and elders who were in Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in the faith, and they increased in numbers daily. He was very practical. He's like, yeah, you don't need to, but everybody knows your father was a Greek, and they're just not going to listen to us if you're not circumcised. I want to win the Jews. I want them to know Christ. So although you are free from that, like, obligation, you don't have to in order to be saved. But in ministry, to love on these guys and take away any obstacle, I think you should get circumcised. To the Gentile, to those outside the law, And so he talks about the chapter 10, but like if you go and sit at a table, so this is something that Jews and non-Jews would never do. They would never eat together because food laws were such a big deal. It would feel so impurifying to sit and eat with a non-Jew. And yet Paul goes, you know what? To those outside the law, I'm going to eat what you eat. You give me some shellfish, I'm going to eat it. You give me some pork, I'm going to eat it. I'll never forget that Marilyn Laszlo. She's a missionary to Papua New Guinea. She was a girl from Indiana, and she decides to become a missionary. She goes to Papua New Guinea, like in the tribes and whatever, and they're like, "Oh, let's eat," and they give her on a banana leaf grubs. You know what I'm saying? Like gigantic worm insects. This is what we eat. And she was like, she narrates how like that was so disgusting. But in order to win them, she eats it. That's love, right? That's love. To the weak, he became weak. So people who had trouble with meat sacrificed to idols. Yeah, you're free from that. Like we all know that that's nothing. But to love you and to potentially win you for Christ, he says, I will never eat meat. It's another example of restraining out of love. How can we continue this pattern? Right? How can we continue this pattern? And as you look around you, and as you look at people and remove obstacles for them to come to Christ, how can we continue this pattern? Right? To the poor, to not flaunt your wealth, to limit yourself. You know, we talked about this last week, but maybe you're not going to order all of those Amazon packages that come every day to your house. Maybe you're not going to buy the Porsche to flaunt your wealth to others. To those who struggle with video games or internet or whatever, to limit yourself, though you have the right to love your brother. There was a story that someone told me that one of the guys was just sharing with his house how he really struggled with in the area of lust and just his thought life, and he was just sharing with them that often it happens at nighttime when like the day is done and his mind just goes wild and he has such a hard time with that, and he was kind of repenting. He just shared with his house, and so what one of the guys in the house decided to do was just sleep on the floor next to his brother. It's like, okay, this is the time. This is when it's hard for you. I don't know what I can do, but I'm just going to stay next to you during the time when it's hard for you. He had a right to sleep on his own bed, of course. But he restricted his own freedom for the sake of his brother. Is that legalistic? No. I think it's limiting yourself in love. Now notice what he does not say. So he says, to the Jew I became a Jew, right? To those outside the law I became to those outside the law. To the weak I became weak. He does not say to the strong I have become strong. To those who operate out of knowledge and selfishness, I also operate out of knowledge and selfishness. No, he doesn't say that, right? He descends, always descends. So I guess what I want to ask all of us today is, do you even know what this feels like? To restrain yourself out of love for someone? Like if I give you a worksheet and I ask you to fill out, like, how have you limited yourself and for whom? How much could you write? I think Apostle Paul could have filled that out, like double-sided, boom, boom. He could fit like 3 letters full of the ways that he limited himself to love other people. It's the essence of Christian life. This is the argument that Paul is making from 1 Corinthians 1 to 1 Corinthians 16, to limit yourself in love. And if you don't have a lot of entries there, why not? God calls us to restrain from our rights. Jesus said it this way: carry your cross every day. Carry your cross every day. Maybe it comes down to even your time or the feeling of awkwardness that you feel. all of your time. It's your right to use however you want. But maybe to sort of restrain that and give it to other people out of love, to love others incarnationally and remove obstacles for them to come to faith. Yeah, we need to share the gospel with people, but it's not as simple as GOSPEL, right? It's not as simple as like the bridge illustration. Hey, boom, okay, now, you Christian? Like, no. Okay. Now what? Now what? Because you know there are obstacles, right? You know there are reasons why they don't want to come to faith. And God has appointed you to be in their life as his hands and feet in love and remove as many obstacles from their life as you possibly can. How is that going to happen? By you becoming strong? No. It's going to happen by you becoming weak. It's going to happen by you loving people incarnationally and giving and restricting your rights to remove as many obstacles as possible. I've always loved this quote from an atheist. His name is Penn Jillette. If you know the magicians, Penn and Teller, they have a show called Can You Fool Penn and Teller or something like that, because they're magicians. They've been on Las Vegas for many years, and so young magicians will come and try to do their thing, and the whole premise of the show is like, if Penn and Teller can tell how you did the magic trick, then you lose or something. But if you can fool them, then you win. Something like that. So anyway, he said this. Mind you, he's an atheist, okay? He says this. I've always said that I don't respect people who don't proselytize, okay? This means share your faith. He says, I don't respect people, like he's an atheist, but he says, I don't respect people who don't share their faith. I don't respect that at all. If you believe that there's a heaven and a hell, and people could be going to hell or not getting eternal life or whatever, and you think that, well, it's not really worth telling them this because it would make it socially awkward, how much do you have to hate someone to not proselytize? How much do you have to hate somebody to believe that everlasting life is possible and not tell them that? Now, I think that's a little bit unfair. Okay, it's a little bit unfair because it's much more complicated than that. But I think we get the gist, right? Like if we actually believe in heaven and hell, we actually believe that we've been made new in Christ and that only through him we can have a reconciled relationship with God. If we have the blessings of the gospel, but we refuse to limit ourselves, restrain our rights, to remove obstacles for other people to receive that, what is that about? Apostle Paul's motivation is very clear. I do all of these things that I might win some. So, second applicational point. Who can I love? And how can I limit myself to remove obstacles for them to hear and accept the gospel? I'm only going to give you about a minute for this, but I want you to write down some names of people who don't know Jesus that you love in your life. And maybe start identifying, here's an obstacle in their life. And maybe you won't get to the point of like, okay, well, I can do this. It might not get there yet. But I just want you to start thinking about some people, the obstacles that they might have, and the attitude of Apostle Paul. To the Jew, I became a Jew. To those outside the law, I became those outside the law. And how can you be incarnationally loving towards those people in your life, right? So I'm going to give you a minute for that. If all the stuff that we've talked about so far in this chapter seems hard, it is. It's incredibly hard. It's very hard. In fact, I would venture to guess that many of you have tried this. And it's hard. It's really tough to maintain this. And I think that's why Apostle Paul then transitions into something that seems like a non sequitur, but I think actually is really important because he starts talking about discipline. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run? So as we read this passage, when you think like what picture of Christian life is depicted through these verses, okay? So do you not know that in a race all the runners run? It's not a stroll in the woods. It's a race. All the runners run, but only one receives a prize. So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. So I don't know if you've ever seen, so the best part of every Rocky movie or martial arts movie, it's always the training montage, right? they're like, if you've ever seen those videos on like Kobe or like LeBron or like Steph working out, like the reason they can be so good is because they're jacking up like 1,000 shots a day. Like it is insane how much they train, right, to be good at what they do. And he's like, an athlete exercises self-control in all things. Like these guys have to wake up really early and work out and then like eat chicken and eggs for lunch because they don't want to they don't gotta eat pizza and then they work out again and then they like, what I'm saying, they eat broccoli. Like they're always exercising self-control, right, to achieve a certain end. And they're like, but that's a perishable wreath. Isn't it worth self-discipline for an imperishable wreath? Like someone who comes to faith, that is an eternal thing. It says, so I discipline my body. Without discipline, you're not really able to love anyone consistently, right? Consistently. You won't be able to keep it up. And your Christian life just becomes rhetoric. It's talking the talk without walking the walk. Because the truth is, restraining ourselves out of love is the most unnatural thing that we can do. Our whole lives, all we do is for our benefit. That's the most natural thing that we can do. And to unlearn those old habits is really hard. How can we get from loving ourselves to loving others, doing whatever we want to restraining ourselves for others? How do we get from one place to another? It's through discipline. So, spiritual disciplines, DT prayer, it's like the bread and butter, right? Steph, how does he become the greatest shooter in the world? He just starts by shooting 1,000 shots every day, 1,000 shots, 100 from here, free throw line, 100 from here, 100 from here. How do concert pianists get really good at what they do? They do the scales. They do that every day. John Coe, he has a cousin who's a concert pianist. He said that, she said that, if she doesn't do her scales for 3 days, her hands feel wrong, feel rusty, oh, this is weird. That's how she gets so good. Spiritual disciplines. Discipline with your studies, maybe. Because you can't love anyone if you're constantly late in your assignments. Discipline with your time, right? I'm going to discipline my time, and I'm going to give some of this to other people, and not simply use all of it for myself. Now, of course, it's not just discipline, right? We need the Holy Spirit. We need the right motivations. If you do this in order to earn favor from God, it gets sour. So Paul's motivation was very clear. It's to love other people so that they can know Jesus, right? So we need the right motivations. But to make those motivations live out in reality. So your Christian life is not just rhetoric. You need that discipline, okay? All right, so let's pray.